2 words. That's all it took to put 88 million people on notice. Quite traumatic. On February 12, 2026, the President of the United States stood in front of cameras and told Iran what would happen if they refused to stop building nuclear weapons. He didn't say serious consequences. He didn't say all options are on the table. He said it would be quite traumatic. The same day he said those words, the largest warship ever built by any nation in human history changed course. It turned away from the Caribbean, it pointed toward the Persian Gulf, and it joined a second aircraft carrier already sitting within striking distance of Iran's coast. 2 carriers, hundreds of aircraft, thousands of cruise missiles, tens of thousands of American sailors, all moving toward the same body of water at the same time. But here's what no one is telling you.
Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more awe-inspiring stories of faith, survival, and miracles.
The people running the negotiations with Iran, the president's own team, privately estimated the chances of reaching a deal at one number: 0. They sent diplomats to a meeting they believed would fail, while sending warships to prepare for what comes after. And when you see what was actually sitting on the president's desk, the 3 military options that were leaked to the press during active negotiations, you're going to understand why quite traumatic might be the most dangerous 2 words any American president has spoken in a generation. But that's not even the part that should stop you cold. Because there's an ancient text written 2,600 years before any of these ships existed that names the exact nation at the center of this crisis, by name. And what it says happens to that nation will change how you see everything unfolding right now. Presidents choose their words carefully. Every statement is reviewed. Every phrase is measured. When the leader of the most powerful military on earth describes what will happen to another country, those words carry weight that most people never fully grasp. So let's look at exactly what was said. February 12, 2026. President Donald Trump addressed reporters and delivered a direct message to Iran. The nuclear program must stop. Negotiations must move forward. A deal must be reached. And if none of that happens, the result would be, in his words, quite traumatic, very traumatic. Now think about that word, traumatic. Not difficult, not unfortunate, not challenging, traumatic. That word means damage. It means pain that doesn't heal quickly. It means something that changes the shape of what it touches. And he didn't stop there. When reporters asked about the military buildup happening at that exact moment, about ships moving toward the Gulf, his answer was 6 words: in case we don't make a deal. 6 words that quietly admitted something the White House had never formally said out loud. They were planning for failure. Then he added one more line that turned the whole situation into a ticking clock. If we have a deal, the carrier leaves. If we don't, it stays. That's not negotiation. That's a deadline with a flight deck. But here's what most people missed in that press conference. Because on the same day he gave that warning, something else was happening behind the scenes. Something that changes the meaning of every word he said. The USS Gerald R Ford, fresh from supporting a military operation that had just removed a dictator from power in Venezuela weeks earlier, received new orders. Not to go home, not to a port for maintenance, to the Middle East. The same ship that had just proven it could support a regime change operation was being sent to the doorstep of another regime. And when reporters asked Trump about Iran's government on February 14th, just 2 days later, he said something that made the warning even heavier. He said regime change in Iran would be the best thing. Not a long-term hope, not a distant goal, the best thing, period. He wasn't guessing about what might happen. He was speaking from a playbook his own military had just used, and the ships were already moving.
The United States does not move aircraft carriers the way you move furniture.
You need to understand what was actually heading toward Iran to grasp how serious this moment had become. A carrier strike group is the most expensive military weapon on the planet. The Ford alone cost over $13 billion to build. It carries between 60 and 75 aircraft, stealth fighters, electronic warfare planes, early warning aircraft, helicopters, drones. Around it moves a wall of guided missile destroyers, cruisers, supply ships, and at least one submarine hiding beneath the surface. Over 5,000 people crew this single ship. It burns hundreds of thousands of gallons of fuel every day. You don't send it somewhere unless the people making the decision, the people who see intelligence you and I will never see, believe there is a real chance those weapons will be used. And they sent two. The Lincoln was already there. It had been stationed in the region since mid-2025. It was the most forward-deployed carrier in the world, and it had already been involved in direct contact with Iranian forces. On February 3rd, just 9 days before Trump's warning, a stealth fighter launched from the Lincoln's deck and shot down an Iranian reconnaissance drone. The drone had approached the carrier aggressively. Central Command described its intent as unclear. The response was not unclear. They destroyed it. So the Lincoln was already in position. The threat was already real. Deterrence was already working. And Trump ordered a second carrier anyway. That decision is the detail that should keep you up at night, because you don't need two carriers for deterrence. One carrier tells an enemy, don't try it. Two carriers tell an enemy something very different. Two carriers mean sustained operations, not a single night of strikes, weeks of strikes, continuous air coverage, around-the-clock sorties, the ability to hit targets, rotate squadrons, rearm, refuel, and hit again without stopping. One carrier is a warning. Two carriers is a war footing. But there's another layer to this deployment that almost every analyst overlooked, and it connects directly to what had just happened on the other side of the world. The Ford had been in the Caribbean. It had been providing air support for Operation Absolute Resolve, the January 3rd Special Forces mission that captured Venezuelan dictator Nicolas Maduro. That operation was planned in secret, executed with precision, and completed in weeks. Roughly 100 casualties, a dictator removed, a new government installed. And now that same ship, with that same crew, carrying that same proven capability, was heading toward Iran. Think about the message that sends. Not just we have ships, but we just used these ships to remove a government last month, and now they're heading your way. The carrier isn't just a weapon, it's a resume. And the resume now includes successful regime change. That's the military picture. But the diplomatic picture was telling a completely different story, or was it? Here's where this situation turns from concerning to deeply alarming, and I need you to hold this contradiction in your mind for the rest of this video, because this tension is what drives everything that follows. On one track, diplomacy. The United States and Iran had started indirect nuclear talks in Muscat, Oman on February 6th. These were the first serious negotiations since the previous round collapsed in mid-2025. That failure was followed by 12 days of war between Israel and Iran in June. American bombers had struck Iranian nuclear sites. The damage was severe. Now both sides were back at the table. Secretary of State Marco Rubio stated publicly that any deal must cover not just nuclear weapons, but ballistic missiles too. The U.S. was demanding everything. Iran was offering almost nothing. And the deadline was measured in days. On the other track, war. Two carrier strike groups moving into position, strike options being reviewed, military planners preparing for the moment diplomacy fails. Both tracks running at the same time, in the same week, under the same president. But here's the detail that changes everything. February 17th, Geneva, Switzerland, the second round of direct talks. American envoys on one side, Iranian officials on the other, Oman mediating between them. and behind closed doors, U.S. officials made their own private assessment of the chances of reaching an agreement. Their number was 0. Let that land. 0. Not low, not unlikely, 0. They sent their top negotiators to a meeting they believed had absolutely no chance of producing a deal. At the exact same time, they were moving a second aircraft carrier into combat position. When governments say peace while preparing for war, when diplomats shake hands while carriers change course, when the public message is hope and the private assessment is 0, that is a pattern, a very specific pattern. And it's a pattern that Scripture describes with one particular word: suddenly. The Apostle Paul wrote that when people declare peace and safety, sudden destruction comes upon them like labor pains on a pregnant woman. They do not escape. I'm not saying this moment is that moment. I want to be clear about that. But the pattern Paul described, peace on the surface and destruction underneath, is exactly what was happening in the second week of February 2026. Hope and armada, optimism and ordnance, diplomats talking while warships sailed. And if the talks failed, if the 0% prediction proved correct, the president had already told the world what would follow.
Quite dramatic.
But you haven't seen what was actually being planned yet. The options that were sitting on the president's desk will show you just how far this could go. What I'm about to walk you through comes from reporting that cited 3 U.S. officials with direct knowledge of White House discussions. These are not announced orders, they are reported options. That difference matters. But the fact that they appeared in public reporting at all is itself a signal. Because in Washington, leaks at this level are never accidental. They are messages, sent through newsprint instead of diplomatic cables. The options being weighed fell into 3 categories, and each one is more serious than the last. First, airstrikes targeting Iran's nuclear program, specifically the enrichment facilities, the centrifuge installations, the underground sites that survived the June 2025 strikes. Intelligence showed Iran was rebuilding. New centrifuges, fortified bunkers, deeper facilities designed to survive exactly the kind of attack that hit them the first time.
Before those 2025 strikes, Iran had been enriching uranium to 60% purity. Weapons grade is 90%. The jump from 60 to 90 is much shorter and much faster than getting to 60 in the first place, and the evidence suggested they were heading right back to that level. Second, strikes targeting Iran's ballistic missile capability. Launch sites, production facilities, storage depots. This matters because Iran has said publicly and repeatedly that its missile program is not up for discussion, ever. Those missiles are their main defense. They make up for an air force that cannot compete with American or Israeli jets. Destroying them would change the military balance of the entire Middle East for a decade. Third, and this is the one that made Washington stop breathing, special operations, American commandos on the ground inside Iran, targeting specific military sites from inside the country. This is not bombing from 30,000 feet. This is boots on the ground inside a nation of 88 million people with a military and a Revolutionary Guard that numbers in the hundreds of thousands. The last time America tried a ground operation inside Iran was 1980, Operation Eagle Claw, the hostage rescue attempt that ended in a fiery crash in the desert. 8 Americans died, 0 hostages were saved. It became a symbol of military failure for an entire generation. And now that option was back on the table. Now I want to be responsible here. Military planners always prepare a full range of options. Most plans never leave the folder. But the fact that these specific options were leaked to the press during active negotiations tells you which outcome the administration thought was more likely. They weren't leaking to be careless. They were leaking to send a message to Iran through the front page. We've mapped this, we've staffed this, and now we're letting you know. But the strike options are only part of the picture.
because 5 separate triggers were all converging in the same week. To understand why this moment is different from every other warning that came before it, you need to see the full picture. Not one trigger, 5, all arriving at the same time, all pointing in the same direction. And when they stack up like this, the room for miscalculation shrinks to almost nothing. Trigger 1. The nuclear clock was speeding up. Iran had been enriching uranium to 60% before the 2025 strikes. The gap between 60% and weapons-grade 90% is small, and it can be closed fast. Despite the damage from those strikes, intelligence showed the program was rebuilding, new centrifuges spinning, new bunkers being dug. The breakout timeline, the amount of time Iran would need to produce enough material for a single weapon, was getting shorter by the week. Once that timeline crosses a certain point, no deal can undo it. No inspection can unlearn the science, and no amount of talking can put the centrifuges back in the box. Trigger 2. The missile talks were dead before they started. Secretary Rubio demanded that any deal must include Iran's ballistic missiles. Iran said publicly those missiles would never be part of any negotiation, ever. 2 positions with 0 overlap. The talks hadn't failed yet. They were designed to fail. Trigger 3. Israel's patience had run out. On February 11th, Trump met with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. The public message was about increasing economic pressure on Iran, but the real message was deeper. Netanyahu has never believed Iran can be trusted to keep any agreement, and Israel has both the ability and the history to act alone. If Jerusalem decided Washington's deal left Iran's nuclear capability intact, Israeli jets could be in the air before the ink dried. Trigger 4. The president said the quiet part out loud. February 14th. Trump told reporters that regime change in Iran would be the best thing. Not a distant hope, not a theoretical outcome, the best thing, period. That language does not leave room for a deal with the current Iranian government. You don't negotiate with a government you've publicly said should be replaced. Trigger 5. The Geneva deadline. February 17th. Second round of talks. American and Iranian negotiators sitting across from each other in Switzerland. And the administration's own private assessment of success was 0. 5 triggers, same week. Nuclear timeline shrinking. Missile talks impossible. Israel ready to act alone. A president calling for regime change, and a peace meeting nobody believed would work. That's the world in which quite traumatic was spoken. That's the context behind every ship movement, every leaked option, every diplomatic handshake. But there's a dimension to this crisis that has nothing to do with politics or military power. A dimension that affects every single person watching this right now. And it comes down to one narrow strip of water that the entire global economy depends on. If everything you've seen so far feels distant, like something happening far away that doesn't touch your life, this section will change that. The Strait of Hormuz, a narrow corridor of ocean between Iran on one side and Oman and the United Arab Emirates on the other. At its narrowest point, it's 21 miles wide. The shipping lane that every oil tanker must pass through is roughly 6 miles across. 6 miles. That thin line of water carries roughly 20 to 25% of the world's entire oil supply every single day. Some estimates put it closer to 30% during peak periods. Around 21 million barrels of crude oil passing through that corridor every 24 hours. Every tanker carrying Saudi oil, Kuwaiti oil, Iraqi oil, Emirati oil, all of it flows through Hormuz on its way to Asia, Europe, and America. If this crisis escalates, if strikes are launched, if Iran retaliates, if that strait becomes a war zone, the consequences don't stay in the Middle East. They hit your gas station, your grocery store, your heating bill within hours. Oil prices spike, energy markets destabilize, supply chains seize up, Inflation accelerates in every economy on Earth. Stock markets plunge, and governments that can't keep the lights on don't stay in power very long. Here's what makes Iran's position so dangerous even without a nuclear weapon. They don't actually need to close the strait. They just need to threaten to close it, create enough uncertainty that shipping companies reroute, insurance costs skyrocket, and markets start pricing in a war that might never happen. The fear alone does the damage.
That's why this isn't just a Middle Eastern crisis, it's a global one. And it's why every person watching this, whether you live in Texas or Tennessee or anywhere in between, has a stake in what happens next. But now we need to go somewhere most news coverage will never take you, because there's a dimension to this crisis that was written down thousands of years before the first barrel of oil ever flowed through that strait. Now, for those who follow biblical prophecy, what I'm about to show you deserves careful and sober attention. Because the nation at the center of everything we've been discussing isn't just a modern country on a map. It's a nation that Scripture calls by name. If you search your Bible for the word Iran, you won't find it, not once. And that's where most people stop looking. But before 1935, the land we now call Iran was known by a much older name, a name that stretches back over 2,500 years, a name that appears throughout the Old Testament in some of the most important passages ever written, Persia. Persia served in the Persian court after Babylon fell. A Persian king named Cyrus issued the decree that let the Jewish people return from exile and rebuild their temple. Persia is the entire setting for the book of Esther, and Persia appears in the book of Ezekiel in a prophecy that scholars have studied for thousands of years. Ezekiel chapter 38 describes a future event. A coalition of nations, led by a figure called Gog from the land of Magog, invades Israel in the latter days, and the nations listed in that coalition include Persia. Not as a footnote, not as a maybe, as a named member, standing alongside nations that many scholars identify with modern Russia, Turkey, Libya, Sudan, and parts of Central Asia. I want to be very direct about what I am saying and what I am not saying. Ezekiel describes Israel as dwelling safely when this invasion comes. The Hebrew word is betach, meaning security and confidence. Israel today is on constant high alert. Its borders are militarized. Its people live under the threat of rockets and terrorism. That condition of dwelling safely has not been met. The full coalition Ezekiel describes has not formally assembled. Yes, Russia and Iran work together militarily. Drone deals, arms transfers, joint exercises. Yes, Turkey has shifted away from Western alliances. But a coalition of convenience is not the same as the prophetic coalition described in that chapter. I am not saying Trump's warning is a prophetic event. It is a geopolitical event, a military event, a diplomatic event. But here's what I am saying, and this is the part that matters. The alliances Ezekiel described are forming. The relationships are deepening. The nations named in that ancient text are drawing closer together right now, in real time, in ways that would have been unthinkable even 20 years ago. The pieces are on the board. The assembly is not complete, but the movement is undeniable. And there's a pattern here that most people have completely missed. A pattern that works no matter which way this crisis goes. This is the part most people never think through, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. What happens if the United States strikes Iran? If the bombs fall and the nuclear program is destroyed, does that remove Iran from the prophetic picture? No, it deepens it. A strike doesn't erase Iran's place in the coalition Ezekiel describes. It embitters the nation. It drives Iran deeper into Russia's arms. It creates exactly the kind of generational grievance, the kind of burning desire for revenge that, according to Ezekiel, eventually brings the coalition to Israel's borders. American bombs don't cancel prophecy. They pour fuel on it. But now, consider the other path.
What if a deal is reached? What if sanctions are eased? What if the carriers go home and the headlines move on and the world exhales? That also fits the prophetic pattern, because Ezekiel's invasion doesn't come during chaos, it comes during peace, when Israel feels secure, when the guard is down, when the world has stopped watching. War or peace, strikes or a deal, both roads lead to the same destination. The path to Ezekiel 38 runs through destruction and diplomacy alike, through trauma and through calm. And there's one more verse that should sit in your mind right next to everything you've seen in this video. The Apostle Paul wrote in his first letter to the Thessalonians, chapter 5, verse 3, "When they say peace and safety, then sudden destruction comes upon them, like labor pains, and they shall not escape." That verse is not about the crisis, it's about the calm after the crisis, not the war, the peace after the war. The moment everyone relaxes, the moment everyone says it's over. That is the moment Paul says to be most watchful. Do you see the pattern? If the talks fail and strikes come, the alliances that Ezekiel described grow stronger. If the talks succeed and peace comes, the false security that Paul described settles in. Either way, the prophetic trajectory holds. I want to be clear, this is not the time for panic, not the time for setting dates, not the time for claiming fulfillment, but it is the time to pay attention, to watch, to understand that what is unfolding on the news right now was described in a book that was written before the ships, the missiles, and the centrifuges ever existed. And there's one final detail you need to see before we're done. There's another prophet who spoke about this land, and almost nobody connects his words to what is happening right now. The prophet Jeremiah wrote an entire passage about a place called Elam, Jeremiah chapter 49. Elam is the ancient name for the region of southwestern Iran, the exact region where some of the most critical nuclear facilities are located today. And what Jeremiah described was God's judgment on Elam, including the breaking of its bow. In Hebrew, that phrase means the destruction of its primary military strength, its chief weapon, the thing it depends on most. When American stealth bombers dropped massive bunker-busting weapons on the Fordo nuclear facility in June 2025, a facility located in the ancient territory of Elam, some scholars noted the parallel. The bow of Elam, its most dangerous capability, its nuclear program, was being broken, not destroyed completely, but broken. I want to be careful here. Scholars disagree on these interpretations. Reading modern military strikes directly into ancient texts carries real risk. But the geographic alignment, Jeremiah naming Elam, and modern strikes landing in Elam's ancient territory, is at minimum worth noting, and at maximum worth watching very closely. Jesus said in Matthew 24 that you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. Wars and rumors of wars, that is exactly what we are hearing right now. The wars, the strikes, the drone shoot-downs, the regime change operations, and the rumors, the leaked plans, the carrier movements, the two words spoken by a president that put a nation of 88 million people on notice. Both are expected, both must come to pass, and both are not the end. They are the season before the end. The question is not whether these things will happen. The question is whether you're paying attention while they do.